campground. Deep river. Thank you. I'll just invite us to come back in any gentle way that feels right. And we can begin with our conversation on eco-womanism tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for grounding us there. I know that definitely helped to center me in my own body in the space. And my cat even came over and started purring. So I think all beings appreciated that space. So as we started with a grounding moment, I think maybe we start our conversation there as well. Can you reflect with us about groundedness and engagement, from an eco-womanist perspective? Like those two words are the theme of this summit. So we would love to hear kind of your perspective on that.
Thank you. Well, eco-womanism really does understand a sense of groundedness as a rootedness in every being. And in some ways, that can be understood as a deep, deep connection and rootedness or feeling connection with the earth itself. In other ways, there are ways in which groundedness also means carrying that rootedness into the work of activism that we do. When we talk about spiritual activism, which is most likely when we're talking about eco-womanism, we're talking about activism for the earth, often environmental justice or eco-womanist activism, that's really grounded in a sense of spirituality and a rootedness. Eco-womanism is a term, indeed, that has been echoed in womanist thought and womanist theology. Alice Walker is one of the important voices in eco-womanist thought. And as the mother of the term womanism, it was she who actually really raised a lot of consciousness around environmental justice very early in the environmental movement and certainly early in the womanist movement and Black feminist movement. It's particularly important to raise Alice Walker's work because it's she who really encourages all activists, no matter what the social justice issue is, to have some kind of practice and a spiritual practice that's disciplined in a way that one can ground themselves in the energy to ignite a kind of action that is rooted in value, rooted in the earth. And so for eco-womanism, that spiritual practice is key to any of the activity that we do, any of the activism that we do, and nurturing that groundedness, nurturing that spirituality and that spiritual practice is key to staying in the work. As we know, with climate change, there's a very long road ahead of us, no matter where we are on the planet, and staying encouraged and staying active in the work necessitates a deep, deep care, not only care of the planet, but also care of being, care of self. And so that self-care from an eco-womanist perspective is not the kind of individualistic way of thinking about it in a kind of American sense, but it really is a kind of self-care to take care of the self's connection to the earth, the self's connection to value, to spirituality. The very, very nature of eco-womanism is to continue to reflect and to work for a sense of groundedness, but to also create spaces of refuge of groundedness for others. So particularly when we think about women of color, when we think about Black and Brown communities that are most deeply impacted by climate injustice in the States and, of course, around the globe, creating refuge space for them to be able to connect to the earth becomes a deep, deep priority when one is facing racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, discrimination around ability, all at the same time, simultaneously, which is very normative, unfortunately, in American society for many communities of color. It takes a special kind of art to be able to create refuge and to be able to create a sense of resilience. Oftentimes, by coming to a space of groundedness, by really nurturing a sense of spiritual groundedness, one can then recreate a space of refuge that is helpful and healing. That work of creating refuge is justice work. It is environmental justice work, and for eco-womanism, it's work central, as social justice is earth justice and earth justice is social justice. I think in terms of engagement, what's really exciting is the direct link between the eco-womanist method, step 5, and engagement. One of the ways that we see the eco-womanist method, and it's a 7-step method. On step 5, it really uses the word engagement and links eco-womanist methodology to engaging transformation. And so that form of engagement is actually being willing and open to be transformed and to transform. And so particularly for those who are moving from faith or religious traditions in terms of the activation of their spiritual activism, this means being open to the transformation within one's own religious tradition, but also open to being transformed by religious traditions outside of their own. The interfaith and interreligious connection then for eco-womanism is key, not only for this methodological step in terms of an openness to engage and also an openness to engage transformation, but it's also key in part because eco-womanism is celebrated across the African diaspora, which means there are lots of different religious traditions, lots of different spiritualities, lots of indigenous roots that end up carrying a message about self-care and planetary care in them. Putting those conversations in speech, in action with one another requires a kind of vocabulary, a spiritual kind of path, a way of talking across, beyond, and through a variety of different religious traditions. And so in that sense, interfaith dialogue, interreligious dialogue is a part of the foundation of eco-womanism and certainly does speak to the levels of engagement that are possible with an eco-womanist frame.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts. I think where I'll take us first is if engagement is step 5, what are, maybe you could speak on some of the earlier steps of that methodology. I have heard you talk about eco-memory, for example, as a way to reach that groundedness, in order to engage. And I'm curious if you'd like to share a bit about that.
Sure. There are 7 steps to the eco-womanist method, and the eco-womanist method in theology and religion, at least, is deeply, deeply influenced by most liberation theological methods. So typically, a liberation theological method begins with experience and honoring and also validating experience. So when you think about Black theological, it's really honoring Black experience. You think about feminist theological method, it's about honoring women or gendered and even non-gendered or beyond gender kind of experiences. So placing the experience at the center as a first step is typically what we see in liberation kind of theologies. Eco-womanism is very similar in that the first step of the method is to honor experience. Honoring experience for eco-womanism means honoring one's experience with the earth. That could be a memory of a cherished thought or experience that one has had with the earth. It could be a memory that one has of communing with the earth, of seeing the divine through earth, of being able to hear God through nature, to be able to experience healing, for example, through nature. And it can also mean really reflecting critically on the eco-memory that comes up. And so in some sense, eco-memory itself is a kind of counter move because it asks us to remember, to go back in a very deep African sense. It goes back to the value of Sankofa, which is the picture of a bird, kind of looking backward so as to learn from the past, but not staying in the past, kind of moving forward. Always the body of a Sankofa bird is moving forward. But there is this synergy around the past, the present, and the future in African thought, and certainly in African cosmology, that's important for the work of doing eco-memory. It suggests that there's wisdom that emerges from any memory that you might bring that you have had with the earth. And that reflecting on that memory is key for establishing some kind of wisdom on how to move forward. Eco-memory is radical in that it actually invites us to pause and to stop and slow down and remember. And in our culture, particularly, that is a big ask to actually pause and to stop and slow down. This slowing down is really key in terms of not just activating a kind of sense of groundedness, but it's also key in terms of activating a deep wisdom. So in our practice just now, there's a kind of deep wisdom and sound in the spirituals. These are African-American spirituals, Deep River. But that kind of deep wisdom hosts a lot of indigenous kind of religious tradition. And it is that kind of tradition that has a deep, deep value for holding and hosting and honoring the earth, so that the earth is not something to be dominated or ruled over, but the earth is something to be cherished and understood as a part of one's own being. In that sense, this invitation to honor experience and really honor eco-memory evokes a new relationship, a healing and more mutually enhancing relationship, and invites us to consider that we're not to just take care of the earth, but to be stewards of and with the earth, and to also remember that the earth is not to be owned and cannot be owned. The second step of the Eco-Womanist method is really to reflect on that experience in some ways, and that we've just walked through, but to reflect on that particular eco-memory. So for example, as a woman of color, of African descent, and also Native descent, it's important that when I think about eco-memory, I do go back to my own Indigenous ancestors. I go back to my Black ancestors, and it's important to recognize and reflect on the fact that my history with the earth, my experience with the earth, is different than a white person, perhaps, in the United States of America. One could say that that difference holds a lot in terms of the path forward around environmental reparations or ecological reparations, and that it also holds a lot in terms of what comes out in terms of spiritual food or nourishment for the work of moving through climate change. I'll move through these swiftly, and then we'll see if there are questions at the end. The third step of the movement is to conduct womanist analysis, and that is essentially to conduct race, class, gender analysis or intersectional analysis. This is particularly important to reflect on one's experience, but it also is important to reflect on experiences that one might know of, such as cases of environmental racism. So that when we consider Flint, Michigan, or we consider Jackson, Mississippi, or water crises, or the real kind of land grab that we're seeing now for the resource of water. In the future, we actually do use these kind of analytical lenses that are interwoven, intersectional, so that we can ask questions about how does gender show up here? How does race show up here? How does class show up here? How does disability status show up here? How does sexual orientation show up here? When we bring all these questions to the actual incident, then that deepens our analysis, and it also deepens our understanding about a path forward. The fourth step of an eco-womanist method is to critically explore tradition. This particularly is important for African and African American religious thought, in that many of the spirituals, for example, have words and language that bifurcate the earth and heaven. And so in this dualized world, there is a sense in which the body and the spirit are set apart from each other, and earth, certainly, and heaven are set apart from each other in unhelpful ways, actually, and ironically enough, in ways that actually bifurcate or create dualisms. What eco-womanism suggests in its practice and its emphasis on contemplative care is that we really need to be moving into a more non-dual way of being, a more relational way of being. And so often this fourth step rather, allows us to explore tradition really critically, to examine where the dualisms are showing up that may not be helpful. The fifth step of the eco-womanist method is to engage transformation. And that, as I mentioned, has a lot to do with the diasporic reality of religious pluralism across the African diaspora. So that interfaith and interreligious connection and the kind of insights that come from many different religious traditions are actually really key for us being able to map our way forward. The sixth step is to share dialogue, and that is to really begin to think through how do we chart paths together, honoring each other's experience by sharing dialogue and communicating with each other, particularly around difference. This is key for racial difference, but it's across the board. Where anti-racism shows up in an eco-womanist methodology is usually in this area of actually sharing hard dialogue about racism and how it can interrupt the real spaces of environmental justice. And the final step of the eco-womanist method is taking action for justice. And in this case, it can be in the form of activism, but it also can be in the form of ritual, creating liturgy, creating community, certainly raising consciousness, and then taking really, really bold steps, using one's own faith tradition, one's own energy, to be able to raise the higher vibration so that we can see our way through to climate justice.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for, that thoughtful explanation of the methodology. I think one of the things that really struck me, well, a few things, but the pause of reflecting on eco-memory and the self-reflection and the ancestral recognition, right, is in itself an act of political resistance, right? I think we often can skip ahead to those 5, 6, and 7 steps of engagement and transformation without doing that reflection on, touching the earth. Our keynote speaker and earlier speakers, also emphasized this act of honoring the earth by being in communion and relationship with the earth. And I really appreciated that kind of coming together, as well as the interfaith aspects of what you just described, right? Though eco-womanism is a theological framework or based in kind of biblical hermeneutics, it's actually important that it's interreligious and interfaith, and I thought that was very salient. So thank you. I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to say specifically about eco-womanism spirituality and how it reflects the connection between justice, spirituality, and the earth.
Thanks. Yes, one of the gifts I think of eco-womanism, and that has been a huge gift for me, actually, is because I was raised as a Christian and certainly became ordained in the Christian tradition, that this attachment to biblical hermeneutics that you see and you just mentioned in eco-womanism has often been deeply, deeply challenged by and in this moment of engaging transformation. The Bible in the Christian tradition, and particularly in how it's interpreted, the hermeneutics oftentimes that we use in the United States and across the world, really, that the norms that we see through the kind of normative hermeneutical lenses often silence parts of the earth. They often are not at all connected to the wholeness or seeing the earth as a part of human life as a part of ancestral life, the spiritual realm as a part of natural or earth realms. So this kind of cosmology is often reflected in African cosmology and many native cosmologies, many indigenous cosmologies, where actually all three of those realms and many, many more are connected to each other, so that when one is healthy, the other is often healthy. When the other is out of balance, then the humans, for example, are out of balance, then that often means that the earth is also out of balance. So there is something particularly important for eco-womanism that is always consistently challenging biblical hermeneutics, normative ways of thinking, and particularly Christian thought and Christian theology. It's significant to note that one of the reasons why there's always going to be a little bit of criticism on the biblical hermeneutics and a re-examination always about biblical narratives is because eco-womanism, like womanist thought and theology, has been growing up for a really, really long time and really criticizing Christian hegemony and hegemonic practices, as well as dualistic thinking. That kind of dualistic thinking has often led us back to logic of domination. And if we know anything at all about earth justice, we know that the logic of domination that have emerged over time, white supremacy, hierarchical thinking, thinking that we are over other beings, anthropocentrism, all of these are actually not healthy for the planet. As it turns out, the logics, the way that we've been thinking, the way that we've been organizing, the way that we've structured our entire societies are not sustainable for the planet that we live in. And so having to give up those logics of domination, one way to do that is to begin to nurse our Christian thinking and bring our Christian biblical hermeneutics, etc., into conversation with other traditions and other voices that will help us to unload the dangers of hierarchies that are oftentimes kind of interwoven there. So I love the Bible, but I will say that eco-womanism does help us to begin to challenge a lot of the dualisms in the Bible, and not just the Bible, right? There is a lot of different sacred texts, of course, across different religious traditions, but oftentimes it's only in conversation with those texts or across different traditions that we recognize, oh, here's another hierarchy that actually has to be dismantled if we're actually going to be able to get back to ground, if we're actually going to be able to understand what justice is. I think in terms of eco-womanist spirituality and its connections, one of the gifts I think that has emerged out of a lot of interreligious dialogue that I certainly do with an eco-womanist lens has really surfaced in conversation with people like Lama Rod Owens and other Buddhist scholars who are writing more intentionally about mindfulness as aids to racial healing, and really mindfulness as a way of attending to racial trauma when it's happened and as it's happened. It is the case in much of Buddhist thought, and I'm mostly influenced by the Doshin tradition of Buddhism and also by the work of Thich Nhat Hanh and Plum Village, that the earth is really understood as an interbeing, that all things are deeply, deeply woven in to and with each other. Everything is connected. With this understanding, particularly from Buddhist thought, one can take a step back and recognize that any kind of ecological understanding or teaching then weaves us into a different kind of relationship, not over-under relationship, but a different kind of relational relationship with the earth, because we are earth. Earth is us. And so eco-womanism certainly follows in that echo of recognizing that there is a deep, deep interbeing of all things, of all beings. And to recognize that helps us to be able to move more fluidly, more honestly, more authentically with ourselves and with each other. So the eco-womanist spirituality has a deep, deep commitment to anti-racism, but also anti-oppression, not just in personal relationships, but also in our own practice of politics, and also in our own activism for climate justice. So the spirituality is not limited to a faith space or a church or a temple, or a gathering circle or a tree. It's actually a part of life. It is a way of living. It is an approach that helps to honor and to respect. This is particularly important because eco-womanist spirituality has a way of being honest about trauma. It has a way of being honest about historical racial trauma. It has a way of being honest about personal trauma, individual trauma, communal trauma. And because we live on the planet we do, and we have the histories that we have, ignoring this kind of trauma, it actually does not lead us to a skillful means. We actually have to have the courage to be able to meet the trauma, because the reality is, in the work of climate justice and in all of the years that we have to go, we will need each other more than ever, and we will need these new strategies of how to be together as healed as possible. One cannot actually fix anything that you can't face. I think it's the words of James Baldwin. You actually have to face things. And so facing the trauma of racial injustice, of gender injustice, of economic injustice, facing these is one way to begin to face the possibilities alive in earth justice.
Yeah, I think that final note really helps me to think about reparations, ecological reparations, and environmental repair. And we discussed that a little bit at our lunchtime session, but I'm wondering, from this eco-womanist frame, can you speak to race as it relates to environmental repair and ecological reparations?
Yeah, thanks. Eco-womanism, particularly in the step around stepping back and honoring experience, will really invite us to consider the harm that has been done, particularly racial harm that's been done. So it's an invitation for us to do so in our own personal journeys. As a BIPOC person, as an African-American professional, as a woman with the last name that I have, I can go through a list of things that I have actually been impacted by negatively because of racial and gender discrimination. And so there is also the racial trauma of systemic racism and how that shows up in macroaggressions or macroaggressions in the movement. For as long as I've been alive, and much, much longer, right? My ancestors have entire strategies written through code, written through song, written through music, written through a way of being, written through ethical mandates on ways that one ought to live and one ought not to live. These were written as a way of surviving and finding ways to thrive in spite of. Finding these particular codes and ways of being, these ethical ways of being, are actually really key for any work in ethics. And they're also really key in terms of thinking about where the harm is and how the harm needs to be repaired. So the example that I often give in thinking about ecological reparations is the site of the lynching tree. And here's where the work of James Cone and Angela Sims and Loretha Mitchell is very, very helpful. When we go back to Ida B. Wells, this is one of the reasons why the Red Record was such a helpful tool. because it was Ida B. Wells and many, many others who were a part of the anti-lynching campaign who uncovered why lynchings were happening and how many were happening. The site of the lynching tree in American history is an important place to begin to think about environmental justice because of the players in that scene. Oftentimes we see the scene including a tree, a person of African descent often being hung, and a mob of white people, white families, white children even, watching this death scene. So that the players become important because eco-womanists will ask the question, who's responsible for the pain and where is the pain? Where is the harm being done? Well, if we think from an inter-womanist and an eco-womanist perspective, we can see that the tree is in pain. It's not just the lynched body that is also in pain. And even in some ways, the white mob is probably also in pain. To be able to violate another body without thought, without guilt, without remorse, and to do so and find glee or joy in it is an illness. That level of disconnect from one's being, that signals and then perpetuates a disconnect between another human being, and then again creates another disconnect between the earth being or the tree. That's at the root of what has to be uprooted, right? That sense of self-hate or self-denial, that sickness, that illness that takes the form of racism, that's what is not good for the planet, and that's what also is not good for racial justice in that particular scene. From the perspective of the descendants of the lynched body, then, the call out for ecological reparations is key. And for most eco-womanist perspectives, the question starts with how do you repair the relationship between the lynching tree and the descendant of the lynched body, rather than start with the relationship between the descendants of the white mob and the descendants of the lynched body. So the continuation, the connection between the tree and the descendants of the lynched body, Black body, has to be repaired in many, many different ways. Environmental justice and certainly eco-womanism is going to suggest that for Black communities, for BIPOC communities, that the relationship with the earth, the reconnection with the earth, is actually central to be able to open up and heal some of the racial trauma that has happened. So it is the case that white supremacy has actually, one way that it's impacted many communities of color is by taking them away from their own connection with the land, their own connection with earth, in part because racial violence was incited to make them, to force that connection to be severed. Then, of course, we do the work of trying to think about the repair that can happen between the descendants of the Black lynched body and the descendants of the white mob, just in that scene. So you can see just from the three kind of players in this particular lynching site that the work of ecological reparations includes racial justice, but it doesn't just include one frame of racial justice. It actually includes environmental justice and repair with the earth. Particularly for communities of color. That kind of repair, at least in African-American communities, is still being done and is still very vital. We have entire generations of youth who don't know, for example, what a cotton actually looks like, why there has been so much silencing around the history of picking cotton in many kind of Southern families. The entire conversation about rest and refuge, the connection to nature. So we're living in a digital time, in a digital age, where even being with nature is sometimes hard to believe or understand from many of our youth. So repairing the relationship with the earth, particularly for BIPOC communities, is still vital and still very important. So I'll pause here because I know that that scene in itself can create a lot of thinking and lots of space for thinking about ecological reparations. But that's just one place where eco-womanism does help us to start the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll lift up something my colleague and friend Lashina in the chat said, which is where the harm is, and what you were just talking about reminds me of Lama Rad inviting us to return to the source and the source of the grief. And I think grief, ecological grief, grief over these systemic injustices that we're discussing has been, a consistent thread throughout the summit. So one question that I got from the audience, which we have about 10 minutes left. So if any other questions come in, we can keep going for a little, but was what are some practices that ground you during times of intersectional fatigue? So just like what we were, discussing with even that story that you just told, like how do you hold that grief and trauma and like what are some of the practices that kind of allow you to keep coming back?
Thank you. It's a beautiful question. So thank you to the audience member who raised it. So you don't hold it. You don't hold it. You release it as much as possible out of your body and beyond your being. There are lots of different ways of releasing grief. In the African American spiritual tradition and through music, through song, through preaching, through dance, a lot of the gift of those practices allow the grief to actually not be housed and not kept inside, but to be fully released and to be able to be re-embodied then with a spirit of healing and resilience. I will say that there are lots of different practices on how to do that. One of them that I found most effective is the indigenous African practice. It's found in many different traditions, including candomblé, in many even spiritual traditions, and it's spiritual bathing. So essentially getting into some water. When one considers in a very kind of modern way of how one's body feels, if you're able to be in the body, in the water or in an ocean or swimming in salt water, one can recognize or remember that there is a kind of freedom and liberation in that your body in the ocean doesn't necessarily have to carry the tide. The ocean is doing that for you. All you have to do is really go with the flow. So oftentimes getting to the ocean, getting to water, even spiritual bathing. Spiritual bathing is an African tradition whereby the ancestors are called upon, the indigenous understandings, at least in Candomblé, the Orishas are called upon, and there are particular herbs that are used to essentially kind of create a clarity of mind. So getting into water sometimes helps as a spiritual practice. As a practitioner of meditation, I would say that many mindfulness practices help a lot. And so particularly for those of us who are engaged in activism on a day-to-day basis, working with other humans who may or may not be perfect, there are ways in which we do have to cultivate within ourselves, within our own bodies, within our own minds, a sense of peace and groundedness. And so often a 2-minute meditation of breathing, such as the way that we started out our session tonight, can be very, very helpful in cultivating enough spaciousness whereby one can come back to their own breath, their own divine refuge space within, and then reactivate one's own values and principles to recognize what's most important or why am I still in this particular space. I'll lift one final practice and we can certainly keep going if there are other questions. As someone who's Blackfoot and Cherokee, I have been reintroduced recently to peacemaking circles. And these are native ways of essentially creating and dealing with conflict within a community. Peace circles are one way, when guided and facilitated well, of inviting a community and each individual in the community to re-engage their own core values, to be able to name and speak in their own language, and to be able to honestly and authentically share what the trouble is, where the harm is. In a peace circle, whether it's around conflict or whether it's around celebration or joy, the voices and listening to each of the voices around the circle are key. Recognizing and honoring and acknowledging the vibration of each of the voices around the circle is key. And so is the practice of deep listening. So in this practice of peacemaking circles, there is the experience of being heard and also hearing or deeply listening. That can create enough spaciousness to be able to engage a healing and solution and understanding. And as Thich Nhat Hanh will write, when one has understanding, one actually has an invitation to love more deeply. Once you can get into a space of loving and that energy within, you have the capacity at least to be able to host compassion for yourself and for another, regardless of what the harm has done. It is important to note that peacemaking circles are, of course, nonviolent, and most of Buddhist thought is around non-harming and nonviolence. And so in this way, these practices not only are earth-keeping, but they're also peacekeeping. And this is the kind of energy that eco-womanism is also a part of.
Yeah, I think that last example really brings me back to the idea of refuge that you also referenced, right? So one of the other questions that I'm seeing is from an audience member. I'll just read it. I really appreciated the way you redefined self-care and talked about creating spaces of refuge. Do you have some examples of spaces of refuge you have found nourishing for those of us looking to experience or support the existence of such spaces for others? I think the peace circle that you just talked about answers that, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to elaborate if you wanted to on that idea.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to share some of my own work, but I have to admit, we have always had Lama Rod Owens, whose books are filled with lots of beautiful practices. And so I would definitely recommend his work. Good. Good.
It's literally on my desk like all
That's great. That's great. I really cherish his work very, very deeply. I also cherish the work of another Black Buddhist, Kyra Jewel Lingo. She has written an extraordinary, she was a former nun of Thich Nhat Hanh and has done a lot of powerful work around peacemaking and particular refuge building and mindfulness. She does so from her own Buddhist ways and Buddhist ways of teaching. She has a really great website, but also a book. I'm looking at Lama Rods and I don't have Kyra Jewels.
We just put the Kyra Jules
Oh,
website.
thank you. That's
So
great. That's great. Okay, good. I heard the title of the book is escaping me, but it will come to me. Her book, but she also has a number of YouTube videos out there. They're actually through the Plum Village, and she literally has meditations. They're kind of 17 to 18 minutes long, and I would definitely recommend listening to these meditations because they are really, really powerful and literally, thank you, healing our way home. That's so helpful. Thank you. She has wonderful practices in her books that, and also on these you can find them on YouTube or through the Plum Village website, whereby one can experience this really, really deep refuge, even as she's guiding meditations. So she's one definitely to look for as well. I will name that one of the gifts that I've learned from Kaiwa Lingo, and from many different Buddhist scholars, Charles Hallisey at Harvard and Janet Geitzel from Harvard as well, is really the work of fierce compassion. John McCransky is a wonderful leader and Buddhist teacher and Lama as well. And it's the understanding within Buddhism, or an insight really within Buddhism, that compassion is a form of love that invites us to really fiercely hold the best of another's self and the best of ourselves to the light, so that when ourselves or when another acts in a way that is harming, we are compassionate enough to actually hold this a line of accountability with that person, and hold a line of accountability with ourselves, and essentially affirm the self back into being, back into full being. The goodness of who we are, the goodness of who another is going to outshine any harmful action. And so this understanding of fierce compassion has been very, very powerful for me as an African American who works in eco-womanist thought. I find deep, deep similarities in the Buddhist understanding or insight of fierce compassion and the work of Fannie Lou Hamer. Like, here is Fannie Lou Hamer, a civil rights activist, doing extraordinary work at the end of her life, working on freedom cards, really building communities that could eradicate poverty, right? Particularly in Mississippi. But she was willing and able in her own heart, in spite of the brutal racial trauma that she experienced from individual and systemic racism in the Jim Crow South, she was able to feed white families and to help white families to overcome poverty by essentially inviting them into the knowledge, agricultural knowledge of how to farm, of how to create spaces for themselves. This is clearly powerful anti-racist work, but there is also a kind of transformation of heart that we can find in her spirituality that's very, very deeply akin to fierce compassion. The ability to be able to see beyond the obvious, to be able to see beyond racial disconnect, to be able to see beyond racial difference and all the stereotypes, et cetera, to be able to love deep enough, even the ones who have harmed us, to be able to love deep enough to hold them accountable to their best selves and to hold ourselves accountable to our best selves. Thich Nhat Hanh writes very explicitly that if you can only find a glimmer of love, if you can only find a glimmer of goodness in the person, that is enough to be able to prep your heart and cultivate your heart to be able to continue the work of having compassion and moving nonviolently towards another person. That teaching is huge for those of us who are working in climate justice, because the work is so intense and so urgent and so stress-filled that we have to find different modes of being with one another in order to get to the work of climate justice in this particular time.
Wow, what a beautiful reflection for us to close on. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. I could do this the rest of the evening, but I will turn it back to our COO, Elena Candler, to close us out with a few words. My deep, deep gratitude for your wisdom. I will be rewatching this over and over. So thank you.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
Thank you. And exactly to what Liz shared, thank you so much, Dr. Harris, for everything you shared. And to those that were asking in the chat, I've been jotting down the resources that Dr. Harris was sharing about, and I'll include all of them on our website next week. So if you want to either read her book or some of the meditations and stuff, we'll curate a collection of those. So thank you so much for being with us. I just have a few closing reminders and a very short practice if you have time to stay on to just close this session. So I just quickly want to remind you, this is our last session with a speaker, kind of like a thought leadership session. We have a very practical session on Thursday, which is our bonus session. And that will be going over the opportunity we have for houses of worship and organizations in environmental justice communities in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin to receive up to $30,000 for tree planting and maintenance. So I'll be doing that presentation and going over the details, answering questions. So if you are that type of organization or house of worship and want information on how to access that funding, feel free to join on Thursday. Then, as I mentioned, all the slides, the recordings, resources from ideas that speakers have shared, they will all be collected and added to our event website, and we'll email that out next week. But also, if you just go to aessummit.org next week, you'll be able to click through and see all of those collected. And we would love feedback. We have a short summit survey. It's like I tried to keep it to 3 minutes to complete. And it's really helpful for our team as we're brainstorming speakers and topics, what would be most beneficial and meet your curiosity. So please take some time to share what you enjoyed from this summit and what you might like to see at future summits. So with that, I want to offer a closing practice, which I've offered in the past, but I love this practice and like to use it at the conclusion of like a beautiful event or a time of reflection. I'm Buddhist, and from my tradition, this is called a dedication of merit. And so basically the idea is that we don't hold on to any of the goodness or the richness or the healing or, the ways that we've been able to touch grief or connect with the earth. All of that isn't something we hold on to, but we release it back into the world. And so that's kind of the movement that is reflected in this practice. So I'll just read through it, and the practice will also be in the chat if you would like to use it at one of your own gatherings. And this particular version is one that is rooted in connection with the earth and is from our friends over at One Earth Sangha. May all places be held sacred. May all beings be cherished. May all injustices of oppression, devaluation, and theft be fully righted, remedied, and healed. May all who are captured by hatred be freed to the love that is our birthright. May all who are bound by fear discover the safety of understanding. May all who are weighed down by grief be given over to the joy of being. May all who are lost in delusion find a home on the path of wisdom. May all wounds to forests, to rivers, to deserts, and to oceans, all wounds to our Mother Earth, be lovingly restored to bountiful health. May all beings everywhere delight in whale song, bird song, and blue sky. May all beings abide in peace and well-being, awaken and be free. So that is our closing practice. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Harris. It has been an honor to host you. And that's it. I wish everyone a lovely evening, and hope all that was shared enriches you and carries you as we continue this work together. So thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing